Hi everyone, and welcome back to the ALMA certification training. In today's session, we'll discuss metadata configuration and controlled vocabularies. This session is intended for staff users with the General System Administrator role, the Catalog Administrator role, or the Repository Administrator role. If you have not yet listened to the certification training introductory session, please do so before continuing, as it does contain some useful information about the certification training in general. I'm presenting the session today from a live sandbox environment configured almost identically to your own sandbox. I encourage you to follow along in your sandbox. Feel free to pause the recording in order to try out some of the things I'm demonstrating. We are planning a live question and answer call following the training. Please make note of any questions you may have in preparation for that call and submit them to your project team in advance so we can come to that meeting prepared to respond. You may also want to search the ALMA online help for answers to your questions. Metadata configuration. By metadata configuration, I mean customization of the Mark 21 bibliographic and Mark 21 holdings metadata schemas in ALMA. As you know, ALMA supports and conforms to the Mark 21 standard, which, among other things, allows a degree of customization. For example, whether certain fields or subfields can be repeated in a given record, and whether certain fields or subfields are mandatory. We'll discuss how you can make those changes. Controlled vocabularies are used during cataloging. ALMA allows you to create predefined or controlled lists of terms or vocabularies which pop up when a given subfield in the metadata editor. The cataloger selects the desired term from the list rather than typing it. This allows for greater uniformity and reduces typographical errors during cataloging. Let's get started with a discussion of metadata configuration. To customize the Mark 21 metadata schemas, navigate to the Metadata Configuration link under the Resource Management Configuration menu. Click on the profile you want to customize, for example, Mark 21 bibliographic. You can use the filter drop-down to display a subset of the full schema. You can use the find box to jump to a specific field. Note that the find box takes into account any filter that has been selected. So if you were to search for a field in the find box that's already been filtered out, you wouldn't find it. By removing the filter, you can find the field. In the Fields tab, click the Inline Actions button. Select View opens a read-only view of the Mark field. Selecting Edit allows for customization of the field. If the field has already been customized, the Restore link will appear, which allows you to restore the field and any customizations that you've made to the original uncustomized settings. Clicking on Edit, or in this case that it's not yet been customized on Customize, opens the Mark field in the screen. Notice all of the customization options that could possibly exist in the Mark field. Repeatable, yes or no. For this particular field, Mark 245, Mark does not allow repetition of 245, and so therefore repeatable is not a customizable option. Whether the field is mandatory in the bibliographic record or not. In this case, Mark does allow customization, and you may choose to make the 245 mandatory or not. You can update the description of the field. The description will display in the metadata editor as a tooltip when you place your cursor on the field tag. opening the subfields displays similar customization options. You may select any of these subfields as being mandatory or not, and as being repeatable or not. Notice the Assign button in line with each subfield. The Assign button allows you to assign controlled vocabularies to that particular subfield. We'll be discussing controlled vocabularies later in this session. Note that you cannot add or remove any of the subfields that are part of the marked schema. Clicking on the indicators shows similar customization options. You can update the name of the indicator, which will also appear in the tooltip in the metadata editor when placing your cursor on that indicator, and also determine whether the indicator should be mandatory or not in that particular field. After making any changes, click Save, then click Deploy to implement the changes that you've made in Alma. Going back to our schema, we click on the Normalization tab. The Normalization tab is not related to a specific field in the schema. Rather, it applies to the entire schema. The Normalization tab displays the list of normalization rules that have been associated with the process, which allows applying the normalization rule to a set of records. You can edit, copy, and delete existing normalization processes. You can also create a new normalization process. Configuration of normalization rules and associating them with the process is discussed in detail in a separate session. The Validation tab displays the out-of-the-box validation routines used in Alma. Customization of validation routines is beyond the scope of this session. The Validation Exception Profile List tab allows you to define whether marked fields, subfields, and indicators which are not validated are treated as errors or as warnings. Errors must be corrected before the record can be saved. Warnings are informational only. The Validation Exception List displays a list of existing validation exception profiles. Notice that each profile has a default severity, indicating whether invalid metadata discovered by the validation profile will be treated as a warning or as an error. We can edit or copy the existing profiles. Notice at the top of the screen the default severity parameter, which determines whether metadata that's found to fail the validation test is considered to be an error or a warning. The second part of the screen displays exceptions to the default severity. All of the validation checks entered in the bottom part of the screen will be treated in this case as exceptions to the default severity, namely as errors. All other validation checks, which is to say those that are not listed explicitly here, will be treated as warnings. Changing the default severity to error means that the exceptions listed here will be treated as warnings. You may add or remove any of the validation tests, validation checks that are listed in the bottom part of the screen. On the bottom of the screen, you have a list of all of the validation checks that are performed by Alma as part of the validation routines. Notice that selecting one of the messages opens additional appropriate fields in order to determine specifically what tests should be performed. The message defines the generic check that will be performed. The fields allow you to specify specifically which field or subfield or indicator should be included in that exceptional test. To add an additional exception, select a message from the drop-down, enter the specific field or subfield, or in this case, position to a control field, and click Add Validation Severity Exception. And this new row will be added as part of the list of exceptions. When you've finished customizing the exception profile, click Save Profile Details in order to save your changes. If you have any questions about customizing metadata configuration, please feel free to pause the recording and make note of them. Or if you'd like to practice customizing any of the metadata configurations that we've demonstrated, please feel free to do so now. I'd like to go on now to a discussion of controlled vocabularies. Controlled vocabularies allow you to configure a list of terms which can be entered into a selected mark subfield. Only values included in the controlled vocabulary will be valid entries in that subfield. ALMA will generate an alert, either an error or a warning, if any value not in the controlled vocabulary is entered into that subfield. Configuring controlled vocabularies is a two-step process. First, you create the controlled vocabulary, the list of terms which will be allowed in a particular subfield. Second, you associate the list with one or more subfields. To configure a controlled vocabulary, navigate to the Resource Management Configuration menu and click on Controlled Vocabulary Registry. The list of existing controlled vocabularies is displayed. Out-of-the-box controlled vocabularies can be viewed or customized, and if they've been customized, they can be restored to their original out-of-the-box settings. Non-out-of-the-box controlled vocabularies can be deleted in addition. You can create a new controlled vocabulary by clicking on the Add CV button. Provide a name and mandatory description for the vocabulary. Enter a code and description for each term in the controlled vocabulary list. Click on the Add button to add the row to the controlled vocabulary. The values you enter in the code field are the values that will be placed in the subfield and saved with the record as part of the metadata. The description will appear in the pop-up together with the code. If the code is sufficiently descriptive, you can use the same value for the code and the description. If the code is cryptic, consider a more descriptive description. When finished adding terms, go on to the second step. There's no need to save this table. It is saved automatically each time you add a new row. Navigate to the desired mark subfield via Resource Management Configuration menu, Metadata Configuration, as we demonstrated earlier. Open the desired field and subfield. Notice that subfields that are controlled by authority headings cannot have controlled vocabularies assigned to them. For example, mark field 100, subfield A. Click the Inline Assign button for the desired subfield to which you want to add the controlled vocabulary. Choose the controlled vocabulary from the drop-down box, which is populated with all of the controlled vocabularies we just seen. Notice also an option to configure a locally defined controlled vocabulary. Configuration of locally defined controlled vocabularies is the same as the configuration for the controlled vocabularies that we've just demonstrated. The difference is that locally defined vocabularies will be available only for the specific subfield for which they were defined. Let's select the controlled vocabulary we configured previously. Click the Assign button, click Save, and click Deploy to implement the changes in ALMA. If we navigate now to the bibliographic record open in the Metadata Editor, we'll be able to see the controlled vocabulary that we've just configured for Mark Field 245, subfield H. Notice that our field does not have a subfield H. Entering it, however, will cause the controlled vocabulary to pop up on our screen. We select the desired value. The code of the controlled vocabulary is entered into the subfield, and we can save the record. If you have any questions about controlled vocabularies or would like to practice configuring them, please feel free to pause the recording and do so now. Let's go on to a review of our session. We saw how you can customize the Mark 21 metadata schemas within the limits allowed by the Mark standard. You can customize fields, subfields, and indicators as mandatory or not, and for fields and subfields as repeatable or not. You cannot add or delete fields, subfields, or indicators. We also saw how you can customize validation exception profiles, which allow you to determine whether the invalid metadata is treated as an error, which prevents saving the data, or as a warning, which is informational only. We also spoke about controlled vocabularies, or predefined lists of values that can be assigned to subfields and used during cataloging to increase uniformity and decrease cataloging errors. Let's take a look at a few review questions. Question number 1. ALMA allows you to customize Mark 21 in the following ways. A. Add fields and subfields, but not indicators. B. Make certain fields and subfields mandatory or not. C. Make certain fields and subfields repeatable or not. D. A and B. E. B and C. Or F. All of the above. The correct answer to this question is E. B and C. ALMA allows you to make certain fields and subfields mandatory or not, and make certain fields and subfields repeatable or not, within the constraints of the Mark 21 standard. However, you may not add fields or subfields or indicators. Question number 2. ALMA does not allow you to save records that contain invalid metadata. True or false? The answer to this question is false. You may configure the validation exception profiles to treat invalid metadata as warnings, which will be for informational purposes only and will not prevent you from saving the record in ALMA. Question number 3. Controlled vocabularies can A. Increase uniformity of your metadata. B. Reduce cataloging errors. C. Be reused with more than one subfield. Or D, all of the above? The correct answer to this question is D. Controlled vocabularies can increase uniformity, reduce cataloging errors, and be reused with more than one subfield. That concludes this session of ALMA certification training. Thank you very much for your participation. We look forward to receiving your questions in advance of the question and answer session, and look forward to seeing you again in the next session of ALMA certification training. Bye for now.